Hello everyone, my name is Shrideep Mitra and welcome to this video presentation discussing task-based language teaching. The main aims of this presentation are to provide a basic understanding of task-based language teaching, look at two major lesson frameworks of TBLT, and finally we'll look at some course books and how we can adapt them to fit into these frameworks. Firstly, we have to try and define what task-based language teaching is. Briefly, in task-based language lessons, the teacher does not predetermine what language the students will use. A communicative task is at the heart of the lesson, and the language is determined by what learners produce as they complete the task. But what is a task? Well, this is the definition that is provided by Jane Willis. By task, I mean a goal-oriented activity in which learners use language to achieve a real outcome. So there must be a goal, and the outcome that they're trying to achieve should be realistic or authentic. Let's look at some criteria for identifying tasks. There are 6 questions that Dave and Jane Willis mention. And the more confidently we can answer yes to these questions, the more task-like the activity is. So here are the 6 questions. Is it interesting? Is the primary focus on meaning? In other words, is the focus on communication and getting their ideas across? Or is the focus on using specific language, that is grammar or vocabulary? Is there a goal or an outcome? And is success judged in terms of this outcome? Is completion a priority? And is the task real or authentic? And would they find themselves using language in this manner outside the language classroom? Let's look at a task and try to apply this criteria. This is from a blog post on the Teaching English British Council website. At the end, I will share a link to it. And here, Jane Willis discusses these criteria in more detail. And we'll just go over it as quickly as we can. So this is the task, and here are the 6 questions. Please take a minute and answer the questions, and let's see if this is task-like enough. Okay, so generally we'd answer yes to all of these questions because adults do like to brag about how busy they are, and the focus in this task is not on any specific language form. The outcome is to decide and remember who has the busiest day, and deciding who had a busy day and remembering whose day it is, these are the outcomes. And completion is a priority over using specific language. Let's take a look at another task, and this example again is taken from the same blog post I mentioned earlier. So here is the task. And here are the 6 questions. Please take a minute and answer these questions. All right. We can answer yes to the first and the last question. For questions 2, 3, 4, and 5, the answers are most likely no. Perhaps removing the final instruction could help learners focus more on speaking about their grandparents rather than trying to use specific language forms. Also, including a clear outcome, goal, or purpose would inform learners whether they've successfully completed this task or not. We could incorporate success criteria from assessment for learning principles to help learners understand what they need to do to complete this task. And at the end of the task, this success criteria could be used for peer assessment and self-assessment as well. Let's look at a few more examples mentioned by Jane Willis. So this is based on the topic of family and the level of the learners. As we can clearly see, specific language forms are not mentioned in these tasks, and the primary aim is communication and getting their meanings across using whatever language that they know. Let's move on to the next slide. So here are a few questions to help you to try and remember some of the information we looked at in this section of the presentation. What are some of the main features of task-based language teaching? And can you define a task? Can you remember some of the criteria? Again, here are the main features and the criteria that we covered earlier. Please take a minute and go over this to refresh your memory. Let's move on to look at two lesson frameworks in task-based language teaching. There is a strong and a weak form of task-based language teaching. The primary difference is when and how to teach the language structures that are needed to complete the tasks. Advocates of the stronger form of TBLT say that learners should be free to use whatever language they have at their disposal in order to complete the task, and no language practice should be done in advance. On the other hand, the weaker form argues for a language presentation and practice before completing an authentic communicative task. The two frameworks. Here are the basic lesson stages for the two frameworks. Which stages are for the stronger version, and which do you think are for the weaker version? As we can see, before the learners start the task, the weak form includes some practice of the language, whereas the stronger form leaves this focus until after the task is completed. Central to both of these frameworks is the task cycle, which is, firstly, learners complete the task. They then present a report to other students, the entire class, or the teacher, and describe how they completed the task and what they found out about each other. Usually, a simple task is used for the listeners to be engaged. Some teachers prefer to also teach some basic presentation language for this stage. Following the report stage, learners have a chance to analyze the language that they produced with help from the teacher or instructor. Here, the teacher can show them the language that they produced correctly and language that could be improved. The teacher can also present a model, which could be a listening text or reading text, to help learners notice how advanced speakers of the language completed the same task. The analysis stage is usually not very explicit in pointing out specific grammatical items, but the focus is more on noticing and consciousness-raising activities. The final practice stage is where we would likely see more controlled language practice, such as gap fills, sentence completion, etc. This framework is quite flexible, as some instructors may choose to skip the report stage, while others may have multiple mini-task cycles with very brief reports, etc. This framework is supported by second language acquisition theories, in that there is an exposure to rich but comprehensible input of real language, there are opportunities for real language use, it is motivating for learners, and there is a focus on language form, albeit at the end, in the strong form, to avoid fossilization of errors. Learners are allowed to experiment with the language they know in a risk-free environment and test their hypotheses and check what they think to be correct. Let's quickly recap the differences between these two common frameworks. Please take a minute to read these sentences and try to remember the missing words. Here are the answers. Some people would argue that the weaker form of task-based language teaching is not really task-based. Rather, it's task-supported, since it provides learners language to use before reaching the final authentic task. In this final section, we'll take a look at some pages from course books and how they can be adapted to fit into the task-based language teaching framework. Here are some screenshots from the Cutting Edge Pre-Intermediate book, 3rd edition. The Cutting Edge books have tasks at the end of each unit in order to consolidate learning. I've removed the pictures, and I've just kept the rubrics in the order that students are supposed to complete them. Is this following a weak form of TBLT or a strong form? Please take a minute to think about it. Let's look at the lesson stages. This is the pre-task. This is practice. This is the main task. This is the report stage. And finally, we have the analysis, which is provided by the teacher or the instructor. Here we can clearly see that the practice comes before the main task that the learners have to complete. So the Cutting Edge book follows a weak form of TBLT. How could the stages be moved around to follow the strong form of TBLT? Please take a few seconds to think about how you would reorder these stages. Let's take a look at it together. In the strong form, we first have the pre-task. This stage can be understood as a lead-in for learners to get familiar with the topic, think of phrases or language that they may already know. After this, they're thrown right away into the main task, without any language practice as can be seen. This is followed by the report stage, and the learners have to decide on the funniest, saddest, or strangest story. In the analysis stage, I prefer to show learners the language they produced while completing the task and highlight examples of good language and language that can be improved. After this comes the practice stage. The analysis stage here could very easily be replaced with learners listening to the model and answering a few questions about the speaker's stories, as can be seen here. In my experience, I've found that showing learners what they've produced well is quite useful since it gives them a sense of confidence. Here, the practice activity could be extended beyond ticking the useful phrases. It would most likely involve some pronunciation drills, gap fills, sentence completion, etc. Again, here are the two frameworks to help you refresh your memory. Let's look at a page from another course book. This is a screenshot from the Personal Best A2 book. The theme of this unit was food and drink. In previous lessons, we'd already covered the use of some and any, and learners had a pretty good idea of countable and uncountable nouns. Here, although there is a lot of text, we can see the grammar focus is on quantifiers. There is an audio of the man discussing his diet with his friend Amy, and there are some control practice activities given here as well. Where would you start if you were to adapt this material to fit a TBLT framework? I'll give you a minute to think about it. Let's look at it together. The first thing to start with would be the task, since that makes the heart of the lesson. So this is the task that's given in the book. Let's try to apply the criteria to this task given in the book. I would say that we could answer yes to most of the questions here. However, I'm not sure whether success is judged in terms of outcome. The task could be rephrased to compare diets and check who has the healthier diet. Also, although there is a focus on meaning, this could be improved by removing the example conversation given. This way, we don't give away any language that learners need to use to complete this task. And I don't find it to be realistic, since we don't really judge our diets on a scale of 1 to 10. So, making it more task-like. Here's how I made it or attempted to make it more task-like. I feel that the rubric is clearer. It includes some vocabulary that we'd covered in earlier lessons, such as junk food, sweets, carbohydrates, and so on. I've removed the conversation and quantifiers can't be seen in this task. I think it's a bit more realistic since it's common these days, at least that's what I've found amongst my learners, to talk about diets and how to be healthy. There's a clear outcome, and the rubric allows for a language such as how much and how many to be used, since they've been asked to question each other. Now, I'll show you screenshots from different parts of the lesson that I planned and how I adapted this page. Here is the main task, and here are the main stages of the lesson. If you were teaching this lesson, in what order would you teach these stages? Let's try to put it in the strong form language framework. Please take a minute and think about how you would order these stages. Let's look at how I planned my lesson. This was the pre-task. This was the main task. Here is the report stage, the analysis stage, and the practice stage. In the analysis stage, I've included the model for them to listen to in order to compare the language that they used and what advanced speakers of the language used to complete the same task. An important note here. Although I do show learners some examples of language to improve, I don't do the error correction until after they've analyzed the language and done some practice. Keeping in line with TBLT principles and some SLA research, I've found that using a guided discovery approach to teaching grammar works well. Learners look at examples and use the questions to figure out the grammar rules by themselves. The practice stage could be extended further with some control practice or other activities from the back of the book. However, I felt that these frameworks do need an extra stage. When discussing these frameworks, authors such as Jane Willis have mentioned that teachers may want to repeat the task at the end. The idea behind including this extra stage is to give learners a chance to use the language they just analyzed and practiced, and they can use it again and attempt to improve on their initial performance of the task. In this lesson, I tweaked the final task by asking learners to speak to others in the classroom and find out who has the healthiest diet in the entire class, rather than just between them and their partner. To summarize, in task-based language teaching, communicative tasks are the main focus of the lesson. Language should not be predetermined by the instructor, and we should respond to the language being produced by the learners. Tasks should be meaningful and realistic and have an outcome for the students. Most course books today are task supported and they follow a weak form of TBLT, and they're not totally task-based. I feel that task-based language teaching is effective and falls in line with SLA theory, and it is a useful approach to implement in our teaching practice. Here are some of the sources that I looked at, and I included some information from these links in the presentation. And here are some useful links and further reading for you to look at. Thank you very much. My email address is on the screen, and you could always get in touch with me if you have any questions about this presentation.